The Pizza Pie. Mrs. Hua stood in front of the window. In Southern California it did not rain often. The sky had been overcast all morning. Only now did the rain choose to come down. In another hour school would be out for her grandson Bing. She had been thinking about him as she looked out of the window that morning. She felt relieved for a brief moment when the sun shone through the gray clouds. Her daughter-in-law, who her grandson was living with now, had her mind mostly on her research. She would never think of reminding Bing to bring a raincoat, and Bing, who was stubborn then, would not have listened to his mother anyway. Mrs. Hua knew her grandson. Mrs. Hua started to pace the living room. The knitting machine lay idle in front of the television. The unfinished sweater hung limp. The 36th episode of 80,000 Miles of Cloud and Moon, a long series of China travelogues she had squeezed into the video player, had long been finished. Now the empty blue screen was blinking at her. She went to Bing's room and opened the closet. She looked at the only piece in it, a jacket with the label Precious Child on it, which she had bought at the Far Eastern department store in Taipei. She had brought it with her all the way across the ocean. She looked in the closet mirror and caught a glimpse of her dry straw white hair. When Bing was little, whenever there was a change of weather, he would have an asthma attack. She had taken him to the pediatrician at the entrance of the lane where she lived in Taipei. The doctor always gave Bing a shot, and Bing's frightening wheezing always stopped. Now the downpour would definitely make him sick, but she couldn't help much. Her daughter-in-law had custody of him now, and there was a restraining order against her. Her heart felt a crashing pain as she thought about it. Mrs. Hua found herself outside the door, one umbrella in her hand, an extra one in the other, and also Bing's precious child jacket. She was walking toward Bing's elementary school. She had taken care of her grandson when he was a baby. Now the court had ruled that she could go no nearer than 500 feet away from him. Any stranger could walk next to him, and his own grandmother couldn't? There was no justice under the heavens. Who cared about her grandson more than she did? How could she be dangerous to him? Anger and shame, like 1,000 worms, gnawed at her insides. She kept walking toward Edison Elementary and eventually stood across the street, holding her umbrella low. She didn't want anyone to see her, but if she saw Bing coming out without a raincoat in the downpour, she would rush across and put the umbrella over him, restraining order or no restraining order. Maybe this time Bing would come home with her and sit across from her eating the bowl of red bean soup she would prepare for him. Both sides of the street in front of the school were lined with parked cars. The mothers inside them were young. There were 1 or 2 mothers next to her who were also out holding umbrellas. Soon all the students would come out. Mrs. Hua's daughter-in-law had wanted to finish her Ph.D. and had taken Bing back to Taiwan when he was not yet 2 years old. It originally had been the agreement that her daughter-in-law's side of the family would take care of Bing, but later Bing was brought to her. He was frail and had been sick often. Then Mrs. Hua found out he had severe allergies that he had inherited from his mother's side of the family. None of the Hua family members had allergies. Mrs. Hua's husband was killed while on duty. She raised her son alone from kindergarten to his studies abroad. Her son was stubborn like her husband, and Mrs. Hua had used corporal punishment on him. When she hit him, the pain was worse for her. She still believed that her son had several advanced degrees and a wonderful job, all because of his strict upbringing. The old Chinese saying, "The stone will not turn into jade if not well chiseled and polished," held some wisdom. She had used the same method on her grandson, but when she punished Bing, it hurt her even more. She remembered once she had locked him in the closet. He had screamed and shrieked, let me out, Grandma," until his voice became hoarse. She had had to teach him that he could not keep on striking matches in the kitchen. Her daughter-in-law finally received her Ph.D. degree, and Mrs. Hua's son sent a picture of her in a red-striped graduation cap and gown, plus 2 plane tickets for Mrs. Hua and Bing to come to the States. Her son and her daughter-in-law had bought a new house in a quiet residential neighborhood. Bing had his own room next to his parents'. Mrs. Hua's bedroom, with its own bathroom, was at the other end of the 2-story house. It was nice, but when she took Bing for a walk during the day, she couldn't see anyone else walking, and there was no place to shop. If she had wanted a bag of rice or a stalk of scallion, she would have had to wait until the young couple brought them home or were able to drive her to the supermarket to get them. Mrs. Hua's son and her daughter-in-law would get up early and drive to work in separate cars. She took care of Bing during the day. The couple would return from their work dead tired and would eat their dinner in silence. She had tried to strike up a conversation with her son, but he only listened with glaring eyes. She knew that he had been thinking about his work. She couldn't speak with her daughter-in-law at all. The couple would hardly talk to each other at the dining table. She would hear their muffled arguments in their bedroom late at night. One early morning she had gone to Bing's room to get something and saw her daughter-in-law curled up in the old sofa in Bing's room, sleeping. Later her daughter-in-law had decided to send Bing to preschool. 3 weeks later Mrs. Hua had gone back to Taiwan. When she returned to the States, it had been at the request of her son. Her son and her daughter-in-law divorced, and her son had received custody of Bing. That time her son had bought a new 3-bedroom condo. Every other week he had to take Bing to her daughter-in-law, who had an American boyfriend that was once her lab colleague. When her son had first arrived, Mrs. Hua had bragged to her friends that her daughter-in-law was a PhD candidate. Now she wouldn't say a word about it. She couldn't understand how young people divorced so easily. Mrs. Hua's daughter-in-law was pale and thin. She wore glasses and looked like a scholar. Mrs. Hua had wanted a daughter-in-law just to have a college education and not to be career-minded, putting her husband's career ahead of her own. She had wanted to bear at least 2 grandchildren, 1 boy and 1 girl, to carry on the Hua family's name. She hoped her son would listen to her when he was ready to get married again. A successful man must have a devoted wife. She hadn't anticipated that Bing would completely change after her son and her daughter-in-law's divorce. He had not been a talkative child, but now he would hardly say anything. If he did talk, he talked in English, which Mrs. Hua couldn't understand. Each time Bing returned from his mother's place, he had stayed in his room and played video games that her daughter-in-law bought for him on television. This infuriated Mrs. Hua. If Bing wanted anything, both her son and her daughter-in-law would jump in to get it for him. They definitely spoiled him, Mrs. Hua thought. When her son was little, life was much harder. She didn't buy him anything, and he had grown up fine. The rain kept hitting her umbrella. What would happen if Bing walked out and got wet in this drenching rain? Every day Mrs. Hua had prepared snacks, Chinese dumplings, sticky rice balls, and red bean soup for Bing. And she often didn't eat lunch so that they could have the snack together, but Bing didn't like any of the food she prepared for him. She had prepared a Chinese lunch in a lunchbox for him to bring to school. He wanted no part of that, so she began making American sandwiches. He still didn't want it. He insisted on buying lunch at school. She saw how hungry Bing was when he came back from school. She always felt pain inside. He didn't want to eat any snacks she prepared and only wanted pizzas, which his dad had bought frozen. She couldn't remember how many times she had talked to her son about the wrapped frozen pizzas with their hideous-looking toppings and foul-smelling cheese. It didn't look like food to her. It probably had tons of preservatives and cholesterol in it. She didn't eat any animal fat because of her high cholesterol. "Let him eat it if he wants to," her son had repeatedly said. "It will not kill him," he said. One day there had been a freak accident. Bing came back from school and she brought him a bowl of red bean soup with tiny sticky rice balls in it. It was a delicious family snack which Bing's dad loved when he was a child. Bing had refused to eat it and popped a small frozen pizza into the microwave. She grabbed the hot pizza from him and he pushed her. In the push and pull, the hot pizza had fallen on his bare arm. He yelled out, then went into his room and slammed the door. He had not come out for dinner, and she was so angry and hurt by his rudeness that she would not knock on his door. Her son had been on a business trip, and that next morning Bing had gone to school dressed in a long-sleeve shirt. The grandmother and the grandson had not talked to each other for a few days. He ate what had been put on the table and then had gone straight to his room to play video games. There were phone calls during the day. Mrs. Hua could not understand what the strange woman on the phone wanted and had hung up on her. A few days later, Bing had come home with a woman. Later, Mrs. Hua knew she was a social worker from the county. She showed Mrs. Hua that Bing had an infection on his arm from a burn caused by the hot pizza pie. If he had let her seen that burn when the incident had happened and had let her put some drops of sesame oil on it, it would never have been infected in the first place, Mrs. Hua thought. The social worker asked for her son and her daughter-in-law, but they were both unavailable at that time, the daughter-in-law being on vacation. Things got more and more confusing and complicated because of the language barrier. When her son had finally come home, things had gotten out of hand. Bing had told the social welfare office that his grandma had hit him before, and they had made a big issue out of it. Mrs. Hua became the defendant and a child abuser, and the county was the plaintiff. Even hiring a lawyer didn't help. Mrs. Hua had to go to court to answer the charges of contempt of the court. She couldn't contain her shock and her anger when she was found guilty, and the court ruled that Bing should live with his mother. A lot of money was spent, and the result had deeply shocked and humiliated Mrs. Hua. She almost went insane because of the harsh way she had been treated. Mrs. Hua's temples throbbed as she thought of the nightmare. Corporal punishment was the family tradition. If a young child was not punished, he could not grow up straight. That was the ancient wisdom of China. If she did hit Bing, it was for his good. She loved her grandson. How could they say she had abused him? Bing went to live with his mother. Mrs. Hua couldn't go back to Taiwan right away. She had told her friends she had come to take care of Bing because her son had gotten divorced and needed her. She sat in the 3-bedroom condo facing the 4 walls all day. TV and sweater knitting could not comfort her loneliness, and the anger of being wronged gnawed her insides day and night. But today she came again to the school to wait for Bing. Caring about him was against the law. God! Children came out in droves. Some saw their mothers and ran toward the cars. Some ran to the mothers' umbrellas. A few put their jackets over their heads, talking and laughing, splashing in the rainwater. It does not rain much in Southern California after all. Mrs. Hua craned her neck under the umbrella and looked for her grandson. She saw her daughter-in-law in her lab coat holding an umbrella over Bing. They were just walking to the sidewalk. Bing was snug in a new yellow raincoat and a yellow rain hat. Mrs. Hua quickly lowered her umbrella. She could still see the two of them walking across the street from where she was. The rain dipped from the rim of the umbrella onto her daughter-in-law's head. Her black hair stuck on her pale, thin face. Her daughter-in-law was only in her early 30s, but she already looked so worn out. Mrs. Hua held the precious child jacket close to her and walked back toward her condo, trying in vain to hold up the slanting umbrella against the pouring rain.